On today's World Insight with Jian Wei, the first public hearing of the U.S. House impeachment probe, the main takeaway, and how governance benefits from open research and education. In the words of the University of Chicago president, and today's governance makes a difference.
I think governance is in fact very difficult. I mean, it's hard to govern.
And here's our host, Jian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program in the U.S. Capitol, where the first public impeachment hearing against President Donald Trump took place, with millions tuned in, not to mention many around the world. It is the first American impeachment drama in 2 decades. The testimony from the 2 high-ranking U.S. diplomats linked the president more directly to a pressure campaign on Ukraine to investigate political rivals. Before we get down to the discussion about what it really means, let's take a look at this.
I will begin by swearing you in.
2 career diplomats were sworn in as the first witnesses as the U.S. House Intelligence Committee opened impeachment hearings in Washington. At the center of the inquiry, did President Donald Trump solicit foreign interference in U.S. elections? Democrats accuse Trump of abusing his office by holding up military aid to Ukraine in exchange for a Ukrainian investigation into Trump's political rival. The top U.S. envoy in Ukraine, Ambassador William Taylor, testified he was alarmed to learn about the Trump administration's demands to Ukraine, included withholding military aid.
I found a confusing and unusual arrangement for making U.S. policy towards Ukraine. There appeared to be 2 channels of U.S. policymaking and implementation, one regular and one highly irregular.
Taylor said, withholding security assistance in exchange for help with a domestic political campaign in the United States will be crazy. I believed that then, and I believe that now. George Kent, the State Department's top Ukraine official, told the House panel of his concern at the idea of withholding military aid since Ukraine was locked in a conflict with Russia.
As a general principle, I do not believe the United States should ask other countries to engage in selective, politically associated investigations or prosecutions against opponents of those in power, because such selective actions undermine the rule of law, regardless of the country.
They testified that Trump wanted Ukraine's president to publicly announce an investigation into former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, potentially Trump's 2020 political opponent. Republicans on the committee pointed out that neither diplomat had ever met the president and that their testimony was hearsay. Trump supporters say Ukraine's president showed little evidence of feeling under pressure from the White House. But perhaps most importantly, that Ukraine received the aid without announcing any investigation.
I'm too busy to watch it. It's a witch hunt. It's a hoax.
This is a sham and shouldn't be allowed.
The White House dismissed the first day of hearings, which will continue later this week, as boring and a waste of taxpayer time.
On the U.S. House impeachment hearing, let's turn to our panelists. In Washington, D.C., we have Bruce Fein, who is a constitutional lawyer, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. Also joining us in Chicago, we have Laura Schwartz, a former White House Director of Events. Later, we hope to also be joined by other panelists on the show. But first of all, hello to both of you. So I'm sure your eyes are just like many others around the world, gluing to the TV screen, trying to figure out what's going on. First day takeaway, Ms. Schwartz.
Well, the first day takeaway was pretty interesting. Of course, we'll say there's nothing to see here. It was boring. But in the opening statement of Ambassador Taylor to Ukraine, he mentioned that a staff member came forward in the last few days to him and said, you know what? I was sitting next to Ambassador Sondland, the ambassador to the EU, after a meeting in Kiev, of which President Trump, after Ambassador Sondland dialed him up, at a dinner, said that he wanted to know where the investigation process was with the Ukrainian government. Are they ready to start investigations? And so already in the first few minutes, now we see that this didn't just come from Rudy Giuliani thinking it up or any of his other thugs. We see now there's a direct correlation from President Trump. Now, last night when asked about it, President Trump said, I don't remember any phone call. I don't recall that. But guess what? That gentleman that recalled it to the ambassador is now summoned to Capitol Hill tomorrow in closed-door testimony.
I see.
Next week, Ambassador Sondland will be at a public hearing and asked about this very call. So he's kind of boxing himself in, not to say that, well, I don't remember what we talked about, it was perfectly fine. No, he said he never made the call. That can easily be proven. So it's off to a pretty big start here in America.
Already a big drama for the very first day. Is that also your takeaway, Mr. Fain?
No, I think that if you are careful in following the release of the transcribed deposition testimony taken in secret and the newspapers report, there's nothing new. In fact, I don't think we have anything more than what was released over a month ago by Mr. Trump himself, when it was obvious by anyone reading the context that he was asking a favor to have Mr. Zelensky open investigations against Mr. Biden and his son if he was going to get these missiles and $400 million in military and other aid. So the narrative is still the same. I think that what weakens the narrative, if you will, is that the money ultimately was given, it wasn't illegally impounded, and no investigation was undertaken. So there was an effort and it kind of collapsed. It's the same kind of thing that Mr. Mueller uncovered with regard to Mr. Trump's effort to obstruct his investigation. Mr. Trump asked his White House counsel, he asked Corey Lewandowski and others to try to intercede, get Mr. Mueller fired, have Mr. The Attorney General, Mr. Sessions, not recuse himself, do other things, but none of them actually followed the orders. That doesn't make it legal, but it means that the punch is far less pronounced. And the other kind of irony here is that under the Obama administration, he rigidly refused to authorize any sale of what you might call combat military equipment to Ukraine. Mr. Trump, although reluctantly, did sign a bill that did provide for this aid, and then he tried to hold it up, maybe shake down the Ukrainian government without success. But it's a little bit odd for the Democrats and the Democratic administration that refused to give the military aid, then condemn the president because now he's kind of withholding it, but at least it was military aid.
Well, there's a lot of party line already in the answers provided by our two panelists, so whether we agree or not with one another.
But that's not even party line.
Yeah, let's go to Joe Rubin, who is also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State.
By the way, was okay.
Yeah. We'll come back to you, Laura. Go ahead, Mr. Rubin.
Yeah, it's just facts.
Yeah, so do you want me to break the tie?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, no, good morning. No, just on the military aid question, I'd love to talk about that for a little bit, about the Obama administration. That's really, the term is a non sequitur. It's irrelevant to the discussion at hand. The question is, what did the President of the United States right now do with what he had in front of him? So the argument about military aid, past policy, statements made to Vladimir Putin or Medvedev by President Obama to relay to Vladimir Putin, all of that is throwing up smoke, trying to confuse people, and distract from the core issue at hand, which is that the president clearly sought a quid pro quo and clearly is obstructing justice and denying information to the Congress to do a legitimately thorough impeachment inquiry, and he is right now getting away with it because his Republican allies are letting him. But that's what we're looking at right now. The other issues are sideshows.
I see. Mr. Fain, from another perspective, the public support, it seems, for the impeachment hearing, even though the public has not voiced necessarily whether they believe all the accusations are correct or not against the president. What do you make of that? It seems that majority of Americans, at least those being surveyed, are actually supporting this process. What would that mean for the electoral fate of the current president and probably even of the Republican Party?
Well, we know that impeachment is both a political and legal issue, and I do need to make an objection. This particular hearing was not at all about what I consider a really serious offense In fact, it led to Mr. Nixon's article of impeachment number 3 that I helped draft for flouting a congressional subpoena. But I want to underscore yesterday's hearing had nothing to do, zero to do, with flouting subpoenas, which would be a genuine, serious article. And pointing out the reason why Obama policy on Ukraine does have political relevance, because impeachment is political as much as it is legal, is because it looks like if you're trying to say that this very strong policy of aiding Ukraine militarily was undercut by this shakedown, it wasn't all wrong policy because it wasn't the policy under the predecessor. But putting that aside, I want to say that there's no doubt that the public opinion will be, if not decisive, very influential on how this unfolds. We already have 231 members in the House who have signed on saying they're ready to vote for impeachment, at least on some article, which is more than is necessary to send the article to the Senate for a trial. I do not think, however, that yesterday's televised hearings moved the barometer one way or the other. Yeah. I think it was standstill, but you are correct that the public opinion will be decisive.
Mr. Rubin, on the other hand, will this be able to define, the stance of the Republican Party and also Democrats as we are seeing Washington going so much intensely into the election season? Will the president be toxic for his Republican counterparts? Will he be the biggest target that the Democrats could get hold of in terms of using it as a bomb for their own future? I know, Mr. Rubin, you're quite active politically, even locally at this moment. So what do you make of it?
Well, I think that the American people want to have a president that they have confidence in is working for them and not working for his personal benefit, and that's why he's in office. And that theme is going to continue throughout the next year into the next election if President Trump is not removed from office. The question about whether or not his policies work for the American people, but also is he working for the American people? So whichever Democrat comes through the nomination process, again, if President Trump stays in office, that Democrat is going to be making those arguments, and this impeachment discussion will be front and center. I do want to add, though, that the reason that I brought up the question about providing or blocking information or obstruction is because yesterday Republicans made it very clear that these two witnesses were third-hand or fourth-hand, not first-hand, but the Republicans are preventing first-hand witnesses from coming forward, meaning essentially President Trump has ordered them to not come forward. That's why it's an issue. We would love to have first-hand witnesses. Mick Mulvaney is a first-hand witness. The president is preventing him from testifying to a body where he was a member. That needs to change.
But on the other hand, Mr. Schwartz, would all of these really matter that much in terms of how the voters see who should be in the office and what are the priorities for the chief, shall we say, the chief of government for the U.S. Right now? Because the president, over the years, is well known for bringing his family members into the politics, and also well known for also talking about his businesses on the side of being the president of the White House. So would these really upset the voters much? What is the real fundamental issue here at stake, do you think, through the impeachment hearing?
The voters have definitely had, have let a lot of water pass under the bridge with Donald Trump and still support him as their base. I do just want, the gentleman right before me, really appreciate that. Great points based on facts. And let's let it be known that money that was being withheld from Ukraine was only released after the whistleblower's complaint came to Congress 2 days later. So when you get your hand caught in the cookie jar, you're going to put the cookie back and walk away and hope nobody notices. That's what they tried to do, but now we've got this impeachment hearing. It is a marathon, not a sprint. Right now, public opinion in battleground states for Donald Trump have not really changed. And the Democrats will look at that. So will the Republicans. Would they want to change their questioning from going around conspiracy theories as if they're trying to get along with the bully, Donald Trump, on the playground, or will they start asking factual questions? I believe that back in their home states, people want Washington held accountable. A big negative against Hillary Clinton that Donald Trump said through the entire campaign was that if Hillary gets elected, It's going to be investigation, investigation, investigation. And Trump was elected, and it's been all investigation. And he has yet to counter investigations with policy, with putting forth legislation to the Congress. Clinton weathered impeachment because he had a very high approval rating during the process, because he was still getting things done, bills were getting passed, and he was working on legislation for the American people. Donald Trump's office really needs to take a page out of that book, because people on the ground throughout this country during the election want to know how you're going to help their pocketbook, how you're going to improve their health care, education, and more. It's still going to be focused on that.
Mr. Fain, how strong will the Republican Party be siding with the current president throughout this impeachment trial in terms of being a good runner on a marathon if the characteristics of the impeachment trial is exactly that, as termed earlier by our other panelist, Mr. Fain?
Well, I think that if the impeachment stays this very, very narrow, just on the effort, which was, I think, conceded to shake down Ukraine in order to get the money, that is going to hurt the Democrats more than the Republicans. I don't believe that by itself is really the egregious nature of the problem that's created by the Trump presidency building on prior ones, which is the usurpation of executive power to run illegal surveillances, spend money not appropriated by Congress, have people acting instead of confirmed by the Senate in positions at the cabinet level, fighting illegal wars never declared by Congress, claiming that you can stand above the law and flouting all these subpoenas. Now, I just want to add one more point. If the Democrats in the House believe that the defiance of a subpoena is an impeachable offense, and I think they are, they have to vote for it. They can't just say, well, the Republicans are complaining about it's hearsay, and so it becomes impeachable by osmosis. They have to be accountable and say, we'll do what was done with Nixon, and say, we think you're compromising our ability to get the facts. We're impeaching you and throwing you out of office because we can't make a determination without these access to the relevant witnesses. And that's not been done. The Democrats have said nothing in response to alleging an impeachable offense for defying subpoenas.
I see. On the other hand, we see more complicated picture than just the impeachment trial itself. On the other hand, for example, Mr. Rubin, the tax returns of the president once again has become a focus. So you got several layers of things going on about the president. Earlier, they were suggesting whether the president will be able to hold it back. Obviously, the latest from the appeal court suggests they insist on the earlier ruling. So how would this waves, of in a way, accusations against the president now work with one another or work against each other? Help us to understand this. Very complicated from Washington.
Part of what's been very hard for Democrats in particular to swallow over the past several years is that President Trump has gotten away, frankly, with multiple lies, obfuscating and preventing his information about who he is and his background to come forward to the light in the traditional way that we expect from our presidents, and he's gotten away with it and really has avoided having any of these types of scandals stick to him, be it his campaign's collusion with Russia, where there were over 100 meetings, that didn't stick to him. And now the tax returns, as you bring up, typically presidential candidates release their tax returns. Why? Because the American people deserve to know how they made their money and if they are extortable and if they're going to be honest. And the president, he has not shared that information with the American people. So far, no consequences. The challenge for him is, can he avoid that kind of transparency while at the same time avoiding transparency on his dealings with Ukraine and other issues? Turkey is now coming up, and that will be a theme in the upcoming election about whether we actually really know who Donald Trump is and the consequences of that for Americans, which are really impacting policy.
The rest of the world, we have to confess, it's not necessarily knowing all of these details and fascinating zigzaggings of all the hearings and how partisan politics would eventually work in every details, but people are interested in two things. First of all, Mr. Rubin, since you've been working for the State Department, so tell me about your judgment. How is this likely to have an impact on the current White House capability to put its hands on some of the most important issues that needs to be decided on? For example, about foreign relations, about trade, about domestic issues, about social welfare. After all, Mr. President was being put into the office as a result of so-called disconnect within the country. So, Mr. Rubin, help us to understand, what does that mean, that impact? Much or not?
It's significant, and policy decisions are only good and valuable if they can be executed and turn into reality. And that requires a government, and in the case of the State Department, an effective State Department. Right now, the State Department is in deep decline in terms of its effectiveness. The people there are demoralized. They've looked at their best and brightest being attacked publicly by the president, not protected by the Secretary of State. And yesterday was a good example where the Turkish president came and he got a lot of gifts, and the United States, I don't know of one single accomplishment that the president announced for the United States yesterday at the press conference. Turkey is an ally, a NATO ally. We don't want a bad relationship, but that's where the State Department comes in. And right now, it's not functioning well at all.
Mr. Fain, you also work for earlier governments, at least from the other branch of the government. So what do you think will be the impact, you know, for others to understand the sophistication right now of the drama going on, Mr. Fain?
Well, I don't think, at least as the impeachment process is currently unfolding, that the impact on the institutional equilibrium, if you will, between the branches is really going to change much. It's very small, and obviously the State Department is demoralized because Mr. Trump was running roughshod over customary diplomatic channels. But that's not unique either. The State Department was demoralized when Henry Kissinger was National Security Advisor. He's visiting China secretly. The Secretary of State didn't even know what was going on. The State Department basically was operated out of the White House. That was demoralizing to the Secretary of State, William Rogers, and his subordinates. But those are decisions that the President has to live with. I wouldn't overestimate the suggestion that now the government has become paralytic because we have this impeachment. And when we had these processes that were actually much more protracted with regard to Mr. Nixon and Mr. Clinton, the government didn't stop operating. Bills were passed. We confronted the Soviets in the Yom Kippur War. So I don't think we can extrapolate and suggest this is somehow a clear and present danger to the ability of the United States to operate.
I see. Ms. Schwartz, same to you. You've been working at also critical times, I would argue. So how do you see this, you know, drama going on all over Washington would put its chemical impact, in a way, on the people-to-people relations within the White House, and as a result, influencing the policies?
Well, I really hope that people around the world do take away that this is a constitution at work, that the legislative branch is a co-equal check on the executive branch of the government with the presidency, and they are fulfilling their duties to guard the Constitution, and through these hearings determine whether or not it's been infringed by the president. In the meantime, we have to remember that even Ronald Reagan, Republican president, got along with the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. President Clinton, a Democrat under impeachment, still got things done with the Republican Newt Gingrich leading the charge. Honestly, the civility in politics that the American voters say they want to restore election after election really has to start with their vote. And they've got to make their feelings known, because those members of Congress represent them, not themselves, and not the bully on the playground.
All right. Well, a lot to discuss, I'm sure, a lot to watch on as well. It's going to be quite a drama and quite a marathon, as you beautifully put. Laura Schwartz, Joe Rubin, last but certainly not least, Bruce Fain. Really appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, helping us to understand really what does it mean from inside Washington. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, how governance benefits both open research and education, in the words of the University of Chicago president. In today's Governance Makes a Difference. Coming up right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Global governance is indispensable because nations increasingly face enormous challenges that cut across borders and global in scale. Governance can benefit from education that hone in fresh talents and ideas. So in our special series today, Governance Makes a Difference, we get a chance to hear out some of the world's preeminent experts and scholars. Today, we have the president of the University of Chicago. As the head of an academic institution with the most Nobel Prize winners, Robert Zimmer emphasized the free and open inquiry in the bedrock of research and education. Take a listen. What do you make of the issue of governance, the qualities of governance, when we see all the current issues, exploding around the world?
I think governance is in fact very difficult. I mean, it's hard to govern. And I think that one of the things we're seeing is the complexity that people face when they're in these environments. And this happens in large corporations, it happens in large governments, it happens in international governance questions, happens in universities. So I think these are challenging questions, and I think people have to work at them, but they're not that easy.
As an educator, how do you think the ideas about better governance can be also learned and cultivated in the young hearts and young minds on your campus?
Well, I think it's an important thing to do, and again, it is quite a complex issue. I think one thing that is extremely important is to talk to everyone constantly about the importance of honesty and absolute integrity in whatever they're doing. Now, honesty and integrity are a foundation because one of the questions about governance is whether there is trust, whether people are going to believe that you're doing things that you say. Not everybody will always agree with you, but it's very important that people believe that you are saying what it is you're doing, and you're taking your actions in an honest way and in a way that's filled with integrity, even if they may disagree with exactly what it is you're doing. And I believe this question of trust is an absolutely importance, and the question of honesty is absolutely importance, and it provides a foundation for dealing with the complexity of governance, which, as I say, is very complicated and not simple.
Trust and honesty, I did notice those two key words you just said. However, if you look at what we are having these days in the world, you notice that is exactly what is lacking here. So, is this just temporary phenomenon, or this is going to be with us for quite some time? In other words, this generation is likely to be defined by this struggle about trust and also honesty.
It's a little hard to say. I think, again, if you take a long view, you see these questions arising, they become more intense, then they become less intense. So as somebody who grew up as a student in the 1960s, it's a very tumultuous time around the world.
Exactly.
And
how did you guys survive?
Somehow here we are. And so, you've seen periods like this before. They can't have different qualities because the problems are not the same, but this sense of needing trust is very important. But it can also be a question of, do you agree or disagree with the policies? So what I'd say is honesty and trust are not the only thing, but they form an absolute foundation without which everything becomes more difficult.
But what about building trust in America? You've been addressing this issue, Mr. President, to your students over the past few years. Is there a way to do it?
Well, one of the things that we've been emphasizing to our students is the importance of actual meaningful discourse, which is that when you have somebody who disagrees with you, it's important to both understand what they're saying, but also to accept the fact that people can disagree with you without being evil. It's one thing to say, I disagree with you and think you're wrong. It's another thing to say, I disagree with you and therefore you're evil. And I think a very important feature is to have students understand that not all arguments around a certain issue are going to point in the same direction. The world's a complicated place, and you need to allow for differences of opinion, which are inevitable and, in fact, important for coming to reasonable conclusions.
People look at what is going on now and wonder whether it is the lowest time in their lifetime when it comes to the changes. How come, they wonder? Bottom lines, common sense, have already become a luxury in some cases. Mr. President, what do you make of this period of time that we are experiencing right now? Is this the low time, or is this the dawn before a big thing happens? I don't know. I just want to ask your insight here.
Well, predicting the future is really fraught. I don't know anybody who's really very good at that, and I won't pretend to be.
Okay, that's a smart choice. And what about your analysis of this?
Yeah, but looking back, the 20th century had some periods of extreme destruction at massive scale that is almost unimaginable, except when you continue to look back in history. So we shouldn't imagine that we're in some period where we're at the bottom of that of the things humanity has shown itself capable of doing. On the other hand, it's obviously a complex time with a lot of change, a lot of unrest, a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of questions about the quality of governance, and we have to try to get ourselves into a better spot so that we don't see repetitions of this kind of massive destruction.
Where's that better spot?
Better spot is one where people are not being murdered, where there's enough conversation so that the kind of miscalculations that can take place are minimized, where people can think about competing, because competing is a healthy thing, but that they're doing so in straightforward, honest ways without demonizing the others. And if we can get to that spot, that would be a better spot.
Amid China-U.S. trade tensions, Mr. Zimmer, the president of University of Chicago, sent a university-wide email this June in which he stressed the University of Chicago would keep its commitment to support international students and academics. He continued to encourage interactions in science and technology and cultural exchanges among campuses around the world. During his visit to Wuhan University this June, he said his university would still welcome Chinese students and scholars. He said the international engagement would go on despite difficulties. Let's listen to another part of our interview with the University of Chicago president. You were voicing your opinions directly about U.S.-China issue, and you said openly University of Chicago would welcome international students just as before. Now, how much does that take political guts to be able to say it?
I think it's honestly pretty straightforward. It's been something that the university's believed in for a long time. We've made a very big effort recently to do yet more of it, and we had a very clear path, and we're committed to the path. And so we went ahead and continued to do it.
I would assume it could not be done without some kinds of opposition, verbally or non-verbally.
Not really. I think there's a degree of question in the United States, I think, as everybody knows, about the relationship, particularly with China. There are issues around evaluation of various immigration policies and so on. So there are definitely things in the air that raise a lot of questions. But when you have a very clear view of what the nature of your education is about, what the nature of the research environment that you want to create is, and you see the absolute importance of being open and welcoming to people from all countries, it becomes easier to know what to do.
When you think about issues as extreme as decoupling, how much does that impact your understanding of the potential of, state-to-state relations and also educational cooperation?
Well, when we began doing more in China and having more Chinese students come to Chicago, this goes back now over a dozen years, honestly, we knew that there would be times when the U.S.-China relations would be better, there'd be times when they'd be worse. These are two big, complex countries with a lot of interests in common and a lot of competitive interests. And so it's just inevitable that there'll be times when things are better and worse. We're a long-term institution. We take a long view. Our research programs take a long time. Our education programs take a long time. And so we need to be focused on what it is we can do, which is provide outstanding education and a great research environment.
What do you think it might be some of the things the University of Chicago could tell, the stories to the others in your country or elsewhere about what should be the real essence of things when it comes to cooperation, Mr. President?
Yeah, I think there are several things. First of all, people actually need to understand what's going on in the other country much better. If you're sitting in the United States and you look at China, you've got this massive transformation, and people in all sorts of disciplines studying all sorts of things are going to and should want to simply understand, how do you think about that? What can we learn from it? What can the world learn from it? How does one reflect one's assumptions about how to do things based on this? Where is China succeeding? That provide lessons to others. Where is it not succeeding and doesn't provide lessons? So there's a lot to learn from understanding this, and it's so important. Likewise, I think there's an enormous amount to learn for Chinese students and faculty coming to the United States. So I think just from the point of view of providing a good education and a good research environment, these exchanges are exceedingly important. On the other hand, I think they obviously also have a long-term benefit to societies, understanding each other and ultimately figuring out how to work together well over time.
Mr. President, the University of Chicago is well known worldwide for churning out the best talent in the academic world. If you look at the number of Nobel Prizes winners that were originally or related to the University of Chicago, it's the biggest possibly. So how do you look at the quality of academic research, basic research, and as a president of the university, how much do you have to put into the long-term thinking about basic research?
Long-term basic research is an absolute foundation of what we do at the University of Chicago, and it needs to be an important feature of every institution. And we create and sustain an environment where people can challenge current paradigms, think about things in very, very different ways, have their ideas tested by ongoing challenge, and this is part of the environment at the University of Chicago that produces so many people who contribute so many new ideas.
What do you really think fundamentally, Mr. President, is the role of universities?
role of universities, I think, is really threefold. First is to educate students. And what does that mean? It means to provide them with a set of skills, not just knowledge, but intellectual skills and capacities that's going to serve them for their entire life. How do we think about complex problems? How do we challenge assumptions? How do we look at different points of view? And how do they come together? And how can students learn to make their own synthesis out of these very complex questions and complex world?
Do you have to build a Great Wall in a way to safeguard your students so that they could still have access to the kinds of freedom of opportunities and engagement that they should deserve?
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of pressures around constraining speech, constraining discourse. These have always existed. Sometimes they're more extreme, sometimes they're less extreme.
What about now?
Now I would say there's quite a bit of pressure around this. And we've made a very strong statement about this, now known as the Chicago Principles, but endorsed by over 65 other institutions. And we simply believe very strongly in the importance of this type of education. And we aim to protect it. And
do
we
you need to persuade the others, the 65 who signed on this, which you were beginning?
Well, I respect other institutions having to figure out what it is they do. I mean, I clearly have an opinion as to what the nature of the most outstanding education is, and we make it very clear, and it's part of the motivation for the Chicago Principles. But ultimately, every institution needs to figure out for itself what it is, because otherwise it won't be effective just giving them advice.
Robert Zimmer, president from the University of Chicago, talking about academic freedom and the importance of exchanges, particularly at this moment of our world. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.